So I'm going to be talking to you about the Canon project, which is a project which is working on cultural heritage in relation to the history of technical theatre. And we'll start by outlining the challenge that the project is attempting partly to address. Firstly, the history of technical theatre is relatively invisible. Information about it is scattered and largely overlooked. Secondly, the field is vast. If we take our history of theatre back to a modest 2,500 years, perhaps to the classical Greek period, that's still 2,500 years. This project is just looking at Europe. That's still an absolutely huge field of highly diverse practice. And yes, just within Europe, the way that gaslighting was done in theatre in Germany in the 19th century is not the way that gaslighting was done in other parts of Europe in the 19th century. Much of that knowledge is highly localized, so people tend to know what's going on in their own national or regional area, but again, the knowledge isn't that widespread. And there's a lot of material out there. There are collections, there are archives, there's literature. But as I've pointed out, there aren't very many places you can go to try and identify where that stuff is. And there's a big problem with taxonomies. So how is that knowledge and information organized? One of the things we've discovered during this project was actually the piece of technical theatre which is best articulated in terms of its different forms are things like wind machines, because they count as musical instruments. And the music people have done fantastic work creating taxonomies for their musical instruments. And we've just kind of nibbled away at a little corner of that. And part of the problem with creating taxonomies, which is part of what the project is doing, is terminology. So as well as language differences, we find that the same word is used for the same thing in different countries, or different words are used to mean the same thing, same words used to mean different things. It's really quite problematic. And lastly, but by no means least, there's a real lack of theorization of technical theatre. Technical theatre generally, including its history. There's lots of applicable theory from other fields, but generally it hasn't been applied to this area because it's one that's largely overlooked in academic and scholarly terms. So what is the Canon project? It involves 8 partner institutions from 7 different countries across Europe, including Rosebery College, which is where I'm from. It's the UK representative. It's funded by the EU's Erasmus Plus programme. 17 teachers, researchers and practitioners involved in the project. Approximately 35 students at any one time. It's a 3-year project. Was in theory going to finish in August, in just over a month's time. We've got a 6-month extension through to the end of December because of COVID. So we're towards the end now. It's now a 3.5-year project. And in terms of what the project's actually going to be delivering, it's in the process of delivering, firstly, the timelines. This is a digital online timeline of the technical theatre history. So you will look at the timeline, you'll be able to find what things took place, so inventions, particular pieces of equipment, places, people, theatres, and so on, and map those onto a timeline. Rather obviously, and in line with what I was saying just now, it won't be anything like complete, but it will be at least a start in terms of kind of mapping exercise of what information there is and where people might want to approach this history from. And secondly, and with the same ethos, a canon, which is where the name comes from, of 100 people, objects, innovations and places. You will appreciate the number of arguments we've had about what's in the 100 and what isn't. That's why it's a canon, not the canon. We certainly don't claim to be authoritative with this. But again, a starting point for people who may be trying to map what's out there and particularly find out what they don't know about the history of technical theatre. We're also creating learning tools, and that's the main thing I want to talk about in this presentation is some examples of the learning tools that we're creating. We're also looking at teaching methodologies, so drawing on the very diverse practices of the teachers within the project across multiple institutions about how they go about teaching the history of technical theatre. So a kind of recipe book, if you like, a cookbook of ideas just to stimulate people who perhaps are looking at teaching. So you go in and find out if you've got a group of students and you want to do something about the history of lighting, stage lighting, you'll find 2 or 3 things in there that might give you some ideas about how you might go about doing that. And finally, a network of people and organisations who are interested in this field. So we start to find out who's out there who actually knows about this stuff. So the first example I want to look at is based on a book published in 1638 by Nicola Sabatini, who is an Italian architect and theatre practitioner. He wrote a book which is essentially a manual, an instruction book, telling you how to build a theatre. And in his terms, building a theatre, it assumed you already had a building, big empty space you could put your theatre in. But theatres at that time were, in terms of permanent structures, were fairly unusual. So theatres were often built bespoke for a period of time. And he gives a complete instruction manual, essentially, of how to build a theatre. Stage machinery, lighting, so on and so forth. And so what we're doing is we're taking the instruction manual and we're building a digital model following instructions. It's a fairly straightforward process in many ways. And this relies on the fact that some of the partner, both the staff and students involved in the project, come from an architectural background. So they're bringing their kind of architectural approach to sitting down, reading the instructions, and following that build process in a digital environment. And this has brought forth all sorts of interesting insights into Sabatini's ideas that you don't get if you just read the text, because when you read the text, you just make a whole load of assumptions, which you just tend to skim over. And suddenly when you're actually trying to build the thing, you realise all the things that Sabatini doesn't quite tell you, all the things that don't quite make sense or are a little bit contradictory. And you also get an insight into some of the assumptions that he makes that come out of the cultural and social context at the time. So that he goes into quite a lot of detail, perhaps, about how you build a particular piece of scenery, and we come along and we go, oh yeah, that's great. That's exactly how we build pieces of scenery now. So we know exactly how that works. It's great. And then he gets on to lighting, and he says, well, this is easy to do because it works just like the chandelier in your house. And you go, I can assure you it doesn't. That, you know, a few hundred years later, we've completely lost. You know, we have no, there's a series of pulleys and ropes and things, but how does that work? We don't really know because we don't do that anymore. We're also able to connect from the 3-dimensional model back to some of the illustrations which are in Sabatini's book and other contemporary illustrations. So suddenly, things that are very familiar to scholars of theatre of this period suddenly come to life in a new way. We move from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And Sabatini also, of course, includes the auditorium. So again, all of the things that theatre scholars tell us suddenly come to life in a new way. Once you actually model the space and you realise that when the historians say that, bearing in mind these are court theatres largely, so there's a duke, a monarch, a king, whoever, who is the principal audience member, who's on the little raised platform here in the middle of the auditorium. And the audience are there to watch the monarch watch the show. You're not there to watch the show directly. You do, but so you really get a sense of this kind of vicarious experience that this whole theatre is built around, very alien to us in terms of our theatre experience today. And lastly, of course, we can light this model. This is just a very early mock-up that's been lit using contemporary lighting techniques. In due course, we'll be able to model lighting, which is based on the period lighting that would have been used at the time, and again, following Sabatini's instructions. So there's a whole new, another area that opens up once you've got this digital model. Moving on to my second example, the Freshfield House in Hellerau. Hellerau, small town just outside Dresden. And in the early part of the 20th century, a group of people came together to make a really remarkable theatre space, Freshfield House. It was the first time in theatre history, really, that the idea of a neutral space, the empty box, which is now very familiar to us from kind of black box theatres, also familiar, of course, from the white box of the art gallery, which didn't really exist at this time. And as you can see here, the walls are covered in cloth, and behind the cloth was a vast array of light bulbs. Again, you know, we're talking about 1911, 1912, so the light bulbs are pretty new technology at this point. Controlled on several hundred circuits, so you have this extraordinary glowing cube. And this has been known about, you know, since that period. It's in some ways quite well recorded, in other ways not so well recorded. We're particularly interested in the lighting system. So again, a digital model combined with some physical modeling, which I'll be doing with a colleague next week. We're going to build a mock-up of one section of this structure in order that we can get a light meter out and measure the field of light that it actually produces, because we're interested obviously in seeing how accurate our digital model is going to be once we start building some lighting into that. But the real thing that I think I'm particularly interested in this, I've mentioned the student involvement in the project already, is that the Freshfield House at Hellerau came about because of a very particular combination of people who got together at the same place at the same time. And in order to really try and understand that complex network of interconnections, this is a screenshot of a Miro board. I think probably most of you are familiar with the Miro platform, a kind of digital whiteboard platform, which multiple people can be working on at the same time. So this is a fantastic piece of work that some of the students on the project did to pull together just all of the resources they could find and create this, again, this kind of map visually of looking at Hellerau as a place. It was one of the first garden cities, so it had this kind of quite utopian conception behind it as a newly created place. And within that Freshfield House, again, is a utopian approach to what performance might be like, but why not just performance, but the idea of dance and movement as a physical practice that just ordinary people would take part in. So not necessarily seeing that really as a performance or only partly as a performance. And then the conception of it as a performance space and the lighting, the technology. And as those of you familiar with Miro will know, one of the fantastic things about it is this really high level of zoom you get with the technology. And so you can really dive in and closely map this thing. And one of the things in my summary I'll come to in a moment is the way that this is both a learning process from the student's point of view and a research process. And that's been one of the big discoveries for us, I think, on the project. Is the way that it blurs the boundaries, I suppose, between what is research and what is teaching and learning. My last example, which I'll do just very quickly. Some people may be familiar with the game Anno Domini, and I'm not talking about the computer game, I'm talking about the card game, where you get cards, each of which has something from history on one side and the date of it and a short description of it on the other side. And the idea is that you work as a group and everybody lays down a card in turn and you try and get them in chronological order without necessarily knowing chronologically how it works. So we're creating our own version of that, which we call Anno Chapter. And again, so this is content that's coming from our database. And as a kind of gamification, which was touched on slightly earlier this afternoon, as a way of getting students to think about, develop their knowledge, obviously, because sometimes you know, sometimes you have to guess, sometimes you've got a bit of an intuition about where something fits, and sometimes you just boldly stick your card down and hope you don't get challenged as to where it fits within the timeline. So that's maybe giving you a sense of the very different elements there are within the project. trying to pull a few threads together out of this for you. What I found really interesting, what I particularly wanted to kind of highlight in this presentation, is what I call a radical hybridity. The project is hybrid in so many different ways. It involves individual academics, involves groups of academics working on sub-projects within the overall project, sometimes working with students, sometimes working without students as co-researchers. As I touched on just now, teaching, learning, research are all intertwined in ways that sometimes are very difficult to tell what's one and what's the other. It's interdisciplinary in its nature. We've got architects, we've got technologists, we've got designers, all working together. Many of the people are involved in the project are practitioners as well as teachers, as well as researchers. And of course, we're working with this transnational perspective from across multiple countries. And particularly the idea of making, whether that's digital making or physical practical making, and playing as ways of dwelling with the subject. The idea of dwelling with is really important to me in this, I think. You spend time with the material and the content and allow it to speak and allow it to start to tell you how to think about it and how to understand it. So in terms of the outputs of the project, I talked through formally what the outputs are, so that there are those resources that will be created by the project, but also and not anticipated, certainly wasn't in the bid for the funding for the project, the idea of an emergent research methodology that's rooted in the daily practices of teacher, researcher, practitioners working together in community. And that's something which I think is really powerful about the way the project has worked. And connected to that, the idea of pedagogy that really blurs the distinction between teachers and students, research and learning. And I think for me, certainly there's something profoundly ethical about that as an approach. So there we are.
Does anyone have any questions for Nick?
The history of technical relative to opera.
Opera is certainly in the mix, yes.
Yeah, it was from the 70s, quite particularly late 17th, with moving all the way through to Wagner. And we have a huge amount of technology and pretty good documentation, which is unusual. I just wondered.
Yes, opera, I suppose opera because of its scale, its kind of sense of a kind of higher art form, as it were, is often very well documented. So, do a whole other presentation on Bayreuth, for instance, and the innovations of Bayreuth as obviously designed for Wagner's operas and his particular conception of what that experience.
Especially because it starts so early in opera. Yeah, in France particularly.
Yes.
Thank you. We've got one more question in the middle.
Have you tried to compare the results as a part of dwelling into fantastic concept, comparing historical not existing theaters and what you found out about the spatial impression and the space itself to existing ones, just to make them comparable?
That's not directly part of the project. One of the things the project is doing is to bring together existing databases of theatres, which tend to be nationally based. So, for instance, there's a fantastic database of theatres in Italy, both still existing and no longer existing, and trying to bring a kind of common format so that future scholars can explore that. So, for instance, you could sort by auditorium size or auditorium layout or particular technical features that theatres might have. So part of what we're trying to do is to provide kind of access to resources that future scholars and researchers can explore from all sorts of different points of view. But I think that there's so many interesting questions to be asked. Thank you.
One more question from the back.
Thank you very much. You partly answered my question, actually. So I was wondering about the any kind of ontology or like how you sort your metadata, and if you what formally use it to make it interchangeable or possible.
Yeah. So that could have been a whole other presentation. We're using, in terms of kind of formatting of data, we're using Wikidata as a template. It's not in Wikidata, but it's one of the reasons for doing that, firstly, it gives you some access to some tools. So when you're trying to pull in data in different formats, there's a kind of reasonably flexible kind of single format that we can get stuff into. And it's also our plan B, if at some point in the future, because we're thinking about the longevity of this project beyond the funded period, if at some point we lost the institutional support, which is providing the platform that it's all sitting in at the minute, we could export everything we've got into Wikidata. And that seems like at least a reasonable chance of still being around in whatever, however many years' time. But yeah, I'm very happy to, I mean, it's not my area, I'm not that involved in the data side of it, but happy to talk to you afterwards if you've got more detailed questions.